Atamanenko, seconded by Ms. Duncan, Edmonton Strathcona, moves that Bill C-571, an act to amend the Meat Inspection Act and the Safe Food for Canadians Act, slaughter of equines for human consumption, be read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Health. Debate. The Honourable Member for British Columbia, Southern Interior.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's indeed a pleasure to speak to my Bill C-571 today. I will begin by recognizing and thanking all those Canadians who have written letters, signed petitions, and shared information about the horse slaughter industry with me. Mr. Speaker, Bill 571 seeks to recognize that horses are ordinarily kept as domestic animals for recreational and sporting purposes, not to produce meat for human consumption, and may contain substances that are prohibited in food animals. The bill would prohibit horses from being conveyed to slaughter and horse meat from being sold for human consumption. The only exception to the prohibition would be for horses that are raised primarily for the food chain and are accompanied by a complete lifetime record in chronological order of all medical treatments ever administered. To understand why such a distinction needs to be made, it is necessary to examine the nature of the equine industry. The medications that are administered to horses, the purposes for which these medications are commonly used, the implications that are posed to human health from ingesting equine drugs that may be present in horse meat, and the adequacy of the regulations which currently govern the Canadian horse slaughter industry. Mr. Speaker, the question that needs to be answered is, without the enactment of C-571, is it possible to guarantee a safe horse meat product if it is produced from horses that were not raised or regulated within an agricultural industry and were never intended to enter the human food chain until the day of being purchased by a kill buyer under contract to a Canadian horse processor? Last year, 71,961 horses were slaughtered in Canada. Some 85% of the meat derived from these horses was exported to the EU, and the remaining 15% sold domestically. Over half of these horses were imported from the US, a country, I will note, is not permitted to export horse meat to the EU, and where a 2007 ban on horse slaughter remains in place today. It bears keeping in mind that out of a population of some 10 million Canadian and US horses, little more than 1% is slaughtered to produce meat, meaning nearly 99% are not. Whether bred for show, racing, jumping, breeding, pleasure, rodeo, dressage, companionship, or as pet, or for work, horses enter the slaughter supply chain to Canada for processing from a multitude of owners in a myriad of directions. Throughout their lives, a wide variety of medications are administered to keep horses healthy and able to perform in their racing or sporting career, and any other capacity required by their owners. Warning, do not use in horses intended for human consumption, reads the label that is found on an extensive array of common horse drugs and includes, among others, wormers, vaccines, painkillers, tranquilizers, bronchodilators, anabolic steroids, ulcer medications, diuretics, antibiotics, and fertility drugs. You will find most of these drugs listed in Chapter 17, Annex E.5 of Canada's Meat Hygiene Manual of Procedures, under the heading List of Veterinary Drugs Not Permitted for Use in Equine Slaughter for Food. When something is not permitted, any administration of these drugs renders their meat unfit for and unapproved whether or not it can be detected in tests. In his detailed letter of notice to EU Commissioner Tony Borg, Bruce Wagman of the legal firm Schiff Harden, representing Front Range Equine Rescue and the U.S. Humane Society, includes as Exhibit 1 a list of 115 banned and dangerous substances commonly administered to U.S. horses that are slaughtered for horse meat exports to the EU, in contravention of numerous food safety and transparency laws. Also included in Mr. Wagman's letter are 13 signed declarations representing the sworn testimonies of a broad spectrum of American veterinarians, breeders, trainers, and owners attesting to the administration of these drugs to horses they have raised and or cared for. In one example, Dr. Holly Colella, a veterinarian who attends to more than 1,200 horses annually in her practice, testifies that a majority of the substances on Exhibit 1 is regularly and routinely administered to the horses she works with. In her article for Newsweek, What's in Your Horse Burger? Chemicals that Pose Serious Health Risk, Vicky Akoff writes, horses, and particularly race horses, are walking pharmacies. Dr. Nicholas Dodman, one of the authors of the study entitled Association of Phenylbutazone Usage with Horses Bought for Slaughter, a Public Health Risk, that was published in the scientific journal Food and Chemical Toxicology, has stated in interviews that, and I quote, eating them, that is horses, is about as healthful as eating food contaminated with DDT. Dodman's study has clearly shown that mechanisms to ensure the removal from the food chain of horses treated with the drug phenylbutazone, or bute as it is commonly called, are inadequate at best. By matching their registered name to their racetrack drug record over a 5-year period, the Dodman study revealed that 18 thoroughbred racehorses sent for slaughter had been given bute on race day, a drug which is banned for use in any animal intended for human consumption because it causes serious and lethal idiosyncratic adverse effects in humans. Mr. Speaker, Mindy Lovell, a Canadian, has owned horses for over 35 years. She has competed extensively and trained professionally for many years. Currently, she operates a boarding stable in conjunction with a thoroughbred aftercare program. In her experience, the one thing she notes that all horses have in common is the way in which they are cared for with respect to veterinary care and medications. As she writes in her letter to me, one can simply walk into any boarding, training, schooling facility and open the medicine cabinet to clearly see the array of drugs and medications easily available and commonly used on horses. The majority of these are clearly labeled, not to be used on horses intended for human consumption. In testimony before a 2012 congressional committee that was struck on the heels of New York Times' expose on the use of drugs in the racing industry and its relationship to an increased number of horse breakdowns leading to jockey deaths on American racetracks, Arthur B. Hancock III, a fourth-generation horse breeder, declares, today, only 5% of all horses are bleeders, and yet almost 100% receive Lasix on race day. There is only one reason for this. Lasix is a powerful diuretic that allows a racehorse to shed 20 to 30 pounds at race time, thus making it a performance-enhancing drug. Further down in his testimony, he states, in addition to Lasix, nearly 100% of all racehorses run with butazolidine, ketofen, or banamine, along with other therapeutic drugs in their systems. At the same congressional hearing, Catherine Papp, a veterinary practitioner at Penn National Racecourse in Grantville, Pennsylvania, states, the overuse and abuse of medication is rampant at our thoroughbred racetracks and training centers. That abuse is not limited to just performance-enhancing drugs. It encompasses all substances that our trainers think may improve their horse's performance, from valid treatments to hokey and possible dangerous therapies. Medications that are currently being overused at our racetracks include, but are not limited to, antibiotics, corticosteroids, NSAIDs, hormones and their analogs, calmative agents, hypersensitivity agents, and respiratory aids, amongst others. These substances are not just being used inappropriately around race time. More commonly, they are employed during training and at time leading up to races. I cannot tell you how many barns I know that train every one of their horses on phenylbutazone every day, whether they need it or not. And bute alone has many adverse effects to consider, ranging from GI issues to renal issues. End of quote. Also at this committee meeting, Congress heard from Glenn Thompson, a thoroughbred trainer for 30 years and author of the book, The Tradition of Cheating in the Sport of Kings, who stated, from the time you start your first hot walking job until you take out your trainer's license, you were taught if a horse has a health problem, you do whatever it takes to get them healthy for the race. If there's an ankle problem, you give the horse bute. If a horse bleeds, you give them Lasix. If a filly is in season, you give her a shot to take her out of season.
It is very clear that everyone involved in the horse slaughter industry, including Canadian, American, and European regulatory organizations, know full well that it is impossible for them to guarantee the safety of horse meat. In fact, since the United States has no program to control the use of pharmaceutical products given to horses and has no intention of having one, they are not entitled to export horse meat directly to Europe. The comments contained in the audit reports prepared by the Food and Veterinarian Office for the European Union clearly show and outline the shortcomings in our regulatory system as regards the slaughter of horses. Here are some examples from the 2010 audit. First of all, the oversight regime in Canada for the use of pharmaceutical substances in horses for slaughter, in accordance with Council Directive number 9623/EC, is inadequate because it does not include an official verification of the identification, movements, or medical history of but a limited number of horses destined for slaughter. Imported horses were accompanied by a signed statement from the last owner, oftentimes a broker for horses, which indicates medication administered over the past 6 months. However, there is no official guarantee required from authorities in the United States with respect to the verification and accuracy of these statements. Supervision and certification are not enough to overcome the problems identified. In areas as the export of horse meat, standards do not provide adequate guarantees. The certified statement dealing with the veterinarian treatment required for all horses is required for all horses slaughtered, regardless of their origin. However, there is no official control over this, nor is the accuracy or authenticity of the statement verified. Imported animals are accompanied by a sworn statement with respect to veterinarian treatments provided. However, the USDA does not take any responsibility with respect to the origin of animals or does not control or verify the authenticity of this statement in American facilities. We would be, in fact, led to believe that in light of this damaging audit, with respect to the serious risk for human health stemming from the use of medication in animals, horses in fact, the slaughtering industry would be forced to seriously reduce its activities. On the contrary, though, the European Union has called upon Canada to prepare a new plan to remedy the problems with respect to medication used in horse meat. In the meantime, while Canadian and European authorities are looking for ways to rework their regulations while respecting trade agreements, Canadian and American contaminated horses continue to be slaughtered as if nothing were at issue. An investigation by the Star discovered that the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is in fact seriously flawed with respect to the regular number of racehorses sent to the abattoir each year. During the course of a horse's life, for example, many competitive horses like Backstreet Bully receive very strong drugs that are used to enhance performance. These products can, in fact, be deadly if they are found in meat destined for human consumption. 2 of these products, nitroflurazone and phenylbetazone, were administered to Backstreet Bully dozens of times rather, but because of mediocre documentation and insufficient control by the Canadian Oversight Organization, it was authorized to process the meat from this horse and to sell it on the market in Quebec, Europe, and in some restaurants in Toronto. And I quote, "You cannot kill that horse," end of quote, stated Stacey Clark, who works at the Stronach Farm, to a representative from the slaughterhouse. This horse had not received small quantities of these drugs. It had received 21 doses of nitroflurazone, linked to cancer in man, and 23 doses of phenylbutazone, which is linked to bone marrow disease.
Where the primary consideration of owners is the care and treatment of horses is to ensure they perform their career as required, not whether they will end up on someone's dinner plate. We see a wide variety of substances that are commonly and in many cases routinely administered to horses, but are prohibited for use even once if intended for the human food supply. We have exceedingly lax enforcement of a highly inadequate regulatory system, and whereas governments in the EU and US have conducted various studies and considered at length the issues of horse medication and food supply, Canada's Parliament has not yet seen fit to do the same. I'm asking my honourable colleagues to support C-571 at second reading and close with the following statement by Dr. Peggy Larson, a former USDA veterinary medical officer. Based on long-standing medical and scientific principles, it is impossible to declare horse meat safe for human consumption when the horses who are slaughtered for that meat have been exposed to an unidentified and unidentifiable number of drugs, treatments, and substances in unknown and unknowable quantities at various times during their lifetime. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank my member for his comments on this bill. Of course, this bill, if it were to pass into law, would take effect here in Canada. Certainly, I think a lot of the comments he made might be concerns that are outside of Canada. And so I would like to ask him, like, for example, with bute and the presence of bute, CFIA has very strict protocols in place to detect bute, and any horse with bute is not processed for human consumption. It doesn't happen, and Mr. Speaker, there's a 98% compliance rate with that protocol. So the question I'd like to ask my colleague is, does he have concrete examples here in Canada where this law might apply, here in Canada, that would actually validate the concerns that he raised within his speech? Thank you.
The Honourable Member for British Columbia Southern Interior.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague for his questions. The point is that if at once in its lifetime an animal gets any of these prohibited substances administered, and the consensus is that roughly 85 or more percent of horses in North America across the border in both countries have at some point in time in their life been administered these drugs, then that meat is no longer fit for human consumption, whether it's detectable or not according to the tests we use. That's the point. The point is once this animal is administered these drugs, then at no point in time should that animal go into the food chain.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member from BC Southern Interior for pursuing this matter for so long, because he obviously has a very deep concern and has been consulting with the community who are concerned about food safety. I wonder, Mr. Speaker, if the member could speak to the issue of the precautionary principle. And the member from across the way had said that we have a 98% compliance rate. Given the concerns that have been raised over the last several years about the credibility of the capabilities of our food safety program, does he have faith that, in fact, we are stopping the potential the spread of contaminated meat through our food supply system by allowing the racehorses to be used for meat?
The Honourable Member for British Columbia Southern Interior.
Well, I'd like to thank my colleague for her questions. Well, I don't have faith. Actually, the former head of one of the slaughterhouses in Saskatchewan that was shut down said in an interview that he couldn't see how these horses were being sent to the slaughter. He said there was no control over or way of verifying what in fact they were administered. The case of Backstreet Bully, for example, the kill buyer verified that horse had not had any medication in the last 6 months, and where in fact he only had it for 24 hours. So the system of verification isn't present. In Europe, a horse needs to have an equine passport at the age of 6 months, and that has to, all the list of all of the medications have to follow that horse throughout its lifetime. We don't have that kind of control. So I would definitely say we need to have a precautionary principle based on food safety, based on the European system.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. Honorable Deputy.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank my colleague for all the relevant information he has provided us. I would like to know, in comparison with beef, well, We know that beef producers also use antibiotics and other drugs, but in comparison, when we come to toxic effects, can you give us some information, percentages and so on? Thank you. Honourable Member for British Columbia Southern Interior. Well, the beef industry is regulated. With respect to antibiotics, for example, there are strict rules on what can be used and how much. But in the horse industry, there are a number of drugs and substances that are restricted or banned, but in the beef industry, where there are controls, we've had difficulties even there. So we can't really make a comparison. The meat on your plate is not intended for consumption.
Reprise the débat. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank